She looked at me across a tasting table in the sunken garden at Castle and Qley and said, "Just head home. I found a ride." And I held my glass, didn't look up, didn't answer for a second, and then told her to have a safe drive. She kissed me on the cheek and walked out of that distillery like a woman who'd settled something in her favor. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the previous 6 months building the legal case that would leave her with nothing. Some context first, because this story doesn't start at a distillery. It starts in a spreadsheet. My name is Thomas, 51 years old, running a third-party logistics company out of Lexington that moves freight across 14 states. I read a balance sheet the way most men check the weather. First thing every morning, last thing before sleep. My grandfather built a bourbon cellar in the 1950s, and when that passed to me, I expanded it. Not for status, because you don't work that hard for something and just own it. You work that hard to hand it down. Elise and I crossed paths at a charity dinner at Keeneland in 2006. She was striking, and she knew the difference between a single barrel and a small batch without anyone explaining it to her. She could talk about terroir the way a poet talks about light. For 19 years, I thought I'd found my equal. Turns out I was wrong for at least 3 of them. Every October, we drove the Bourbon Trail. Not as tourists, as people who needed to account for another year. The air inside a Kentucky rickhouse carries something you can't quite name. Charred white oak, damp limestone, the faint sweetness of corn mash bleeding through the staves, and underneath all of it, the invisible loss that the industry calls the angel's share. 3 to 5% of every barrel gone to the atmosphere each year. More in that volatile first year, less as the wood breathes slower. Gone. Unrecoverable. I used to find that beautiful, a surrender to time that felt earned. I don't think about it that way anymore. 19 trips, 4 distilleries, same route, same order every time. Woodford Reserve just outside Versailles, then north to Buffalo Trace in Frankfurt, across to Castle and Qley on the old Taylor estate, and finishing at Wild Turkey above the Kentucky River near Lawrenceburg. A clean loop, the way I prefer things. This year, we never made the 4th stop. But let me tell you about the stop we did make. The one I'd been quietly preparing for across 6 months of work. It started 3 years ago with something small, the way these things almost always do. When I renewed the insurance on our private cellar, a discrepancy came back from the broker. The premium had dropped, and not by accident. Someone had updated the asset inventory. A custom-built, climate-controlled room beneath our home in Versailles holds bottles that don't turn up on auction sites because they were never supposed to be available. A pre-Fire Heaven Hill release from before the 1996 distillery blaze. A single authenticated bottle of 1974 Pappy Van Winkle Family Reserve, bottled for the Japanese export market, and a row of privately gifted pre-prohibition recipe recreations from a friend at a craft distillery. Conservative valuation between $380,000 and $500,000, depending on who's buying. The digital inventory log showed the edit timestamped on a Tuesday in March. A Tuesday when I was in Memphis at a logistics conference, hotel receipts confirmed it. Elise held the only other access credentials for that system. I didn't say a word to her. What I did instead was call a man I'd worked with once before on a commercial insurance dispute, a forensic specialist who investigates high-value asset fraud. Over 60 days in the cellar, he cataloged, photographed, and tested everything. And here's what those 60 days turned up. High-end bourbon forgery doesn't require a master's degree. It requires patience, access, and a buyer who won't ask questions. You source bottles with the right shape and embossing, fill them with a convincing proxy, usually a legitimate premium bourbon from the correct era, reseal with wax and a heat gun. And if the labels age correctly and the provenance documents hold up, the bottle moves. 19 bottles in my cellar had been swapped out, and not with cheap substitutes. With good ones, which told me Elise had a consultant, someone who understood enough about the chemistry to make the replacements feel real to anyone who wasn't running lab tests. The originals had been sold through a private broker in Hong Kong, and the wire transfers recovered totaled $312,000. I sat with that number for a week before doing anything else. The second specialist I brought in was a digital forensic investigator named Garrett, who turned out to be more than just her contact. He was a mid-level rare spirits broker who'd been running Elise as an inside source for 3 years. She identified pieces from the cellar, he sourced the proxies and handled the forgeries, and together they split the proceeds through overseas buyers. What Elise didn't know was that Garrett had told at least 2 other women the same story, that he was building a private equity fund for rare collectibles, that his clients were anonymous family offices in Singapore and Dubai, that she was his legitimate partner in something real. What she also didn't know was that a civil judgment against him in Tennessee for a $200,000 fraud case had been settled quietly out of court back in 2021. She thought she'd found a man with resources. She'd found a man with a system. In the weeks before October, I got her on a recorded call under the pretense of reviewing our travel itinerary. Kentucky runs on one-party consent, and I was very much on that line. She named bottles. She referenced Garrett's timeline. At one point, she laughed softly and said I wouldn't notice until the next insurance review, if even then. When she texted me from the Castle and Qley parking lot, I wasn't heading home. I was already pulling into my attorney's office in Lexington. By the time Elise's black SUV rolled into our driveway in Versailles 3 hours later, nothing in the house looked different. No changed locks, no emptied closet, no furniture missing. That's how amateurs do it. Instead, she walked through the front door and found the dining room table. 19 bottles in a single row across the mahogany, the 19 forgeries, one for each year of our marriage, now arranged for a different purpose entirely. Beside them, a tabbed legal folder containing a forensic lab analysis of every bottle, a printed wire transfer ledger, and a copy of Garrett's civil judgment from Tennessee, clipped to the front cover, a one-page summary from my attorney. She was still glowing when she came through the door, the way a person glows after they've managed something difficult, without anyone noticing. Then she looked at the table. Her face moved through confusion, then recognition, then something gray and collapsing, like a floor giving way beneath her feet. I handed her the folder. The 19-year vintage is over, Elise. My voice stayed level, quiet the way a rickhouse is quiet. I've already filed the asset dissipation clause in our prenup. Since you liquidated your portion of the marital estate through unauthorized transfers, your remaining equity in this property calculates at 0. She started to speak, and I held up one finger. Before you say anything, hear this first. 22 minutes of her own voice filled the room. The call she thought was private. The one where she named the bottles, confirmed the wire instructions, and laughed. She tried the pivot. They always try the pivot. She said I'd made her feel alone on these trips, that I cared more about the collection than the marriage, that a man married to bourbon couldn't meet the needs she had. I let her finish every sentence. Then I told her the call had been recorded legally under Kentucky's one-party consent law, that my attorney held the originals, that the civil complaint for asset dissipation had already been filed, and that Garrett, I watched her face when I said his name, had been served at his Nashville office at 11 that morning. She went to the driveway and called him. He didn't pick up the next day either. And when she finally reached him, he told her, his attorney disclosed this in the discovery process, that he couldn't be associated with an active civil defendant, and he wished her well in her next chapter. The man who was her ride had already moved on. I went back on the trail this October alone, and I made all 4 stops. At Wild Turkey, standing on the limestone bluff above the Kentucky River, I opened a bottle I'd held back from the original inventory, an authenticated 1974 Pappy Van Winkle family reserve that my forensic specialist had separately cataloged and secured during his 60 days in the cellar. The one bottle Elise had never flagged to Garrett. It had been sitting in the back of the lowest rack, behind a cedar panel my grandfather added to the wall when he first built the room. She never knew he'd built that shelf. I poured 2 fingers into a Glencairn and held it up against the October light. Amber, clear, and still. After 19 years of tasting, you learn to trust the chemistry. Some things are built to age in the dark, and some things that present as refined are just well-dressed decay. The glass tells you which is which. If you're paying attention, I kept the house, the collection, the 240 untouched bottles, and something worth more than all of it combined. My receipts, my records, my name on the deed without a co-signatory. Elise is a name on a civil filing I stopped thinking about before I even closed the folder. The angel's share is gone, evaporated into whatever she's rebuilding now. But what's in my glass? That pours clean. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe.